Hey everyone, great to have you back. Thanks for tuning in today. We've got a fresh new story for you, so let's jump right in. I never considered myself the type of man to doubt my marriage. Catherine and I had been together for years, raising 2 kids, building careers, and navigating the ups and downs that came with it. The passion had faded somewhat, as it does in any long-term relationship, but I never questioned our bond. I never had a reason to, so when she left for a business trip, I didn't think much of it. The house was quieter without her, but that was expected. Catherine was always the one who filled the space with energy, whether it was reminding Zach to clean his room for the 100th time or singing absent-mindedly while making coffee. Now it was just me and the kids. Our daughter, Ellie, picked at her breakfast, half awake as she scrolled through cartoons on her tablet, while Zach barely looked up from his phone. It hit me, then, how much we all missed her, even if no one said it out loud. That's when the idea came to me. What if we surprised her by flying out to see her? It wasn't unusual for families to visit their loved ones on business trips, and it had been a while since we'd done anything spontaneous. I could already imagine the look on her face when she opened the door to find us standing there. She'd probably shriek, cover her mouth, and then throw herself into my arms, maybe even cry. The kids lit up at the idea, their previous sluggishness gone in an instant. When would we leave? Zach asked, finally looking up from his phone. As soon as I book the tickets, I said, pulling out my laptop. Ellie grinned. Mom's gonna freak out. That's what I was counting on. Booking the tickets took no time at all. The kids packed their bags with the same enthusiasm they had for Christmas morning, and before I knew it, we were on a flight to Dallas. The whole trip, I kept picturing how it would play out. Catherine would open the door, gasp, and then hug us all, thrilled that we had come all this way just to see her. Maybe she'd even take a day off work so we could explore the city together. It was going to be perfect. But as the moment of reunion approached, an unsettling feeling crept into my chest. I chalked it up to nerves, excitement, nothing more. We landed in Dallas late in the evening, the city glowing with lights against the deepening night sky. After picking up a rental car, I drove straight to Catherine's hotel. The lobby was elegant but impersonal, the kind of place designed for business rather than comfort. As I approached the front desk, I pulled out my phone and dialed her number. No answer. I frowned but wasn't too worried. Maybe she was in the shower or had left her phone on silent. Hi, I said to the receptionist. My wife, Catherine, is staying here. Could you call up to her room? I want to surprise her. The woman at the desk gave me a polite but neutral smile, nodding as she punched a few keys on her computer. She should be in room 1210, she said. One moment while I call up. I stepped aside, glancing back at Zach and Ellie, who were looking around the lobby, soaking in the new environment. The phone rang. Once, twice. Then the receptionist's expression changed. Just slightly, but enough for me to notice. She hung up the phone and looked at me, hesitating. She's not answering, sir. I felt the first flicker of something off. Could you try again? She did, but the result was the same. That's when she glanced at her screen again, her lips pressing together. There's an additional guest listed under the room, she said carefully. My brain stuttered for a second. What? She straightened in her chair, clearly regretting saying anything at all. I'm sorry, sir, but I can't give out details about other guests. My mouth felt dry. An additional guest? Her silence was enough of an answer. I nodded stiffly, backing away from the desk. My mind was spinning, but I forced myself to stay calm for the kids. I needed a moment, needed to process. I gestured for Zach and Ellie to follow me. Let's check in first, I said, forcing a smile. They didn't suspect anything. To them, this was still part of the surprise. I booked a room for us on a different floor, my thoughts racing the entire time. As soon as we were settled, I ordered room service for the kids, set them up with a movie, and told them I needed to take care of something. Then I left. The walk to her floor felt longer than it should have. Every step felt heavier, like my body was resisting what my mind already knew. When I reached her door, I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. I tried calling her phone again, and that's when I heard it. Faint, muffled but unmistakable. Her ringtone, coming from inside the room. I exhaled, my heart pounding. She was in there. She just wasn't answering. A slow-burning anger started to build in my chest. I turned on my heel and walked back to the front desk. I locked myself out. I lied, keeping my voice steady. "Can I get a replacement key?" The receptionist hesitated, but I must have looked convincing enough, because a moment later, she handed me a keycard. "Thank you," I murmured, gripping it tightly. Back at the door, I swiped the card. A quiet beep. A green light. The door clicked open. For a brief moment, I didn't move. Something inside me screamed to stop, to walk away, to pretend this wasn't happening. But I stepped inside anyway. The air smelled different. Not like Catherine's perfume. Not like anything I recognized. A mix of cologne, sweat, and something else I didn't want to name. The room was dimly lit. The bed, unmistakably used, was tangled in white hotel sheets. And there, half hidden in the darkness, was Catherine, with a man I had never seen before. For a second, she didn't look guilty. She looked annoyed. My breath caught in my throat. She blinked, adjusting the sheets around her like I had just interrupted a casual conversation, not shattered our entire life. The man beside her, dark-haired, maybe early 40s, sat up, his expression shifting from shock to understanding. Catherine exhaled and finally spoke. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm, too calm, like this wasn't the moment everything had just fallen apart. I stood there, gripping the door handle so tightly my knuckles ached. My whole body felt disconnected, like I was floating outside myself, looking at this scene from some other place. This couldn't be real. This had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Catherine just sat there, watching me. No scrambling for excuses, no guilt-ridden stammering, no desperate attempts to explain. Just that eerie, detached calm. The man beside her finally moved, shifting so he was partially covered by the sheets. He didn't look at me. He looked at her, waiting for her to say something. I forced my mouth to work. "Who is he?" Catherine sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Thomas, let's not do this here." My stomach twisted. "Let's not do this here." Like I had just caught her in a minor lie, not tangled in bed with another man. "Who is he?" I repeated, my voice quieter this time. She glanced at him, then back at me. "This is Andrew." Andrew. Like that name was supposed to mean anything to me. The anger that had been simmering beneath my shock boiled over. I stepped into the room, slamming the door shut behind me. Andrew tensed but didn't move. "How long?" I asked, my voice sharp. Catherine finally showed the first crack in her composure. She looked away, shaking her head slightly. "Thomas, please." "How long?" I growled. She swallowed. "A few months. A few months." I almost laughed. This wasn't some drunken mistake. This wasn't a lapse in judgment. This was deliberate. I turned my gaze to Andrew, who still hadn't spoken. He looked uncomfortable, like he'd rather be anywhere but here. "You married?" I asked him. His jaw tightened. "Divorced, of course." I turned back to Catherine, barely able to look at her. The woman I had built a life with, the woman I had trusted beyond reason, had been sleeping with this man for months. And she had no real remorse. I could see it now. The way she wasn't crying. The way she wasn't begging for forgiveness. The way she had only seemed mildly inconvenienced when I walked through that door. Something inside me snapped into place. A final, brutal clarity. "I brought the kids," I said. For the first time since I stepped into the room, her expression changed. Her eyes widened. "You what?" she whispered. "They're downstairs. Zach, Ellie. They were excited to surprise you." Her face drained of color. "Oh my God." She looked at Andrew, then back at me, realization crashing over her. "They don't know," I continued. "Not yet." Catherine swung her legs over the side of the bed, reaching for the robe draped over a chair. "Thomas, please, don't let them see this." I stared at her, feeling nothing but ice in my veins. "Don't worry. I wouldn't do that to them. She exhaled, shoulders sagging. But you did. Her head snapped up. I took a step back, nodding toward the door. Get dressed. We're leaving. She hesitated, glancing at Andrew. I cut her off with a glare. You can explain to them why you're not coming back. Her breath hitched. Thomas. No, my voice was steel. Get dressed. For the first time since I had walked in, she looked shaken. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. I didn't wait. I didn't give her a chance to plead. I had heard enough. I made it back to the room where Zach and Ellie were curled up on the hotel bed, watching TV and eating the room service I had ordered. They looked so comfortable, so oblivious to what had just happened upstairs. And for a moment, I hesitated. How was I supposed to do this? How was I supposed to rip their world apart in one night? Ellie turned first, smiling through a mouthful of fries. Did she like the surprise? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Zach was still staring at the screen, barely paying attention. Can we go up now? No, I couldn't let them see her like that. Couldn't let them step into the mess she had made. No, I said finally, forcing my voice to stay steady. Mom's, she's busy. We're going home. Ellie frowned. Already? Yeah. I moved toward our bags, picking up what little we had unpacked. Change back into your travel clothes. I'll get us a flight out tonight. She groaned, clearly disappointed, but didn't argue. Zach just shrugged, like it didn't matter one way or another. Good. I didn't want questions. I didn't want to have to come up with answers. As I packed, I heard the sound of the door opening behind me. I didn't turn. Catherine stepped inside, her breathing uneven. I could hear the rustling of fabric as she adjusted whatever she had thrown on. Thomas, she started. I shook my head, zipping up the suitcase. We're leaving, I said flatly. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Please, not like this. I turned then, finally looking at her. The calm detachment she had worn in that hotel room was gone. Now she just looked terrified. You did this, I said quietly. Not me. Ellie perked up at her voice, her face lighting up. Mom! Catherine quickly forced a smile, kneeling down to hug her. Hey, baby, she whispered, brushing Ellie's hair back. Ellie frowned. Why do you look sad? I saw Catherine falter, struggling for words. She couldn't tell her. She wouldn't, and neither would I. Not yet. Zach didn't move from the bed, just glanced over at her before looking back at the TV. Catherine swallowed hard, standing back up. Thomas, she said, softer this time. Please. I stared at her, knowing exactly what she wanted. She wanted me to step outside with her, to let her explain, to give her a chance to rewrite what had already been burned into my mind. But I wasn't interested in hearing it. Get your bags, I said instead. We're leaving in 10. I didn't wait for her response. I went back to packing. Catherine didn't move. I could feel her standing behind me, waiting, hoping I would change my mind. But I kept my hands busy, shoving clothes into suitcases, zipping up backpacks. If I stopped, if I looked at her again, I might lose my resolve. Thomas, she whispered. Can we talk? I turned slowly, meeting her eyes. There was desperation there now, but not the kind I expected. She wasn't devastated that she had hurt me. She was afraid of what came next, afraid of the consequences. What is there to talk about? I asked, keeping my voice low so the kids wouldn't hear. She glanced at them, then back at me. I don't know, but not like this, not in front of them. Ellie was still getting dressed, humming to herself, blissfully unaware of what was happening between us. Zach, on the other hand, was watching. He wasn't saying anything, but his eyes flicked between us, his expression unreadable. We'll talk, I said finally. When we get home. Her shoulders sagged slightly, like she had been bracing for me to say something worse. I didn't care. I lifted the suitcase and headed for the door. Come on, I said to the kids. Ellie skipped toward me, still smiling, but Zach hesitated. He looked at Catherine again, like he was trying to put something together in his head. Then he stood, grabbed his backpack, and walked out without a word. Catherine followed us to the elevator, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I knew she wanted to reach for me, to pull me aside, to fix this before it got out of her control. But there was nothing left to fix. The ride down was silent. The only sound was the occasional ding of the elevator as we passed each floor. Catherine stood beside me, stiff, staring straight ahead. When the doors opened, I stepped out first. She followed closely, like she was afraid I'd leave her behind. But I wasn't waiting for her. I was walking to the front desk. The receptionist looked up, surprised to see me again so soon. "I need to check out," I said. Catherine ked in a breath beside me. "Thomas." I ignored her. The receptionist clicked a few keys on her computer, then smiled. "Of course. Everything's taken care of." "Thanks." I turned, looking at the kids. "Let's go." Catherine reached for my arm. "Wait." Pulled away. Her face crumpled. "Not here," I muttered. I walked toward the doors, my heart pounding in my ears. The warm Dallas night hit me as I stepped outside, but I barely felt it. I was too numb, too angry. Zach and Ellie climbed into the rental car without question. They were tired, worn out from the trip, from the excitement that had turned into something else entirely. Catherine stood on the sidewalk, shifting from one foot to the other. "Thomas," she tried again. I looked at her one last time. Then I got in the car and drove away. The drive to the airport was quiet. Ellie dozed off in the back seat, her head resting against Zach's shoulder. He didn't seem to mind, but he wasn't asleep. He stared out the window, his reflection barely visible in the dark glass. I could tell he was thinking, piecing things together. Catherine hadn't tried to call. Maybe she was still standing outside the hotel, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe she had gone back up to her room. To him. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. I didn't want to think about that. About her. She had already made her choice. When we got to the airport, I parked and turned to Zach. "Stay with your sister for a second. I'll get our flights sorted." He nodded without looking at me. The terminal was packed even though it was late. People moving in all directions, lost in their own lives. I envied them. To them, this was just another night. To me, it was the night everything changed. At the counter, I asked for the next flight home. The woman behind the desk typed something into her computer, then frowned. "The next direct flight isn't until morning," she said. Morning. That meant staying the night in Dallas. I exhaled sharply, rubbing my temple. "What about a layover? Anything sooner?" She nodded. "There's one through Atlanta. Leaves in 2 hours." I didn't care where we had to go, as long as it got us home. "I'll take it." She printed the tickets and I headed back to the kids. Ellie was still asleep. Zach was on his phone, but he put it away when he saw me. "When's the flight?" he asked. "Soon," I said. He nodded, but I could see the tension in his jaw. He wanted to ask something. I waited. Finally, he said, "Did something happen with Mom?" The words hit me harder than I expected. I could lie. I could tell him everything was fine, that the trip just didn't work out. But I didn't want to lie to him. He wasn't a kid anymore. I sat down beside him, careful not to wake Ellie. "Yeah," I said. "Something happened." He didn't ask what. He just nodded again, staring down at his hands. I wanted to say more. Wanted to prepare him for what was coming. But how do you tell your son that his mother isn't the person he thought she was? Couldn't. Not yet. So I just put a hand on his shoulder, giving it a squeeze. "We'll talk when we get home." Zach didn't say anything, but he didn't pull away either. The wait at the airport felt endless. Ellie stirred a few times but stayed asleep, her small body curled up in the chair. Zach kept his eyes on his phone, scrolling through something mindlessly, pretending not to be thinking. I didn't bother pretending. My thoughts were running in circles, each one leading back to the same place. Catherine. I wondered if she had tried calling me yet. I hadn't checked my phone since we left the hotel, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to. What could she possibly say? That she was sorry? That it didn't mean anything? That she still loved me? None of it mattered. The last boarding call for our flight echoed through the terminal, and I nudged Zach. Come on. Time to go. He stood without a word, stretching his legs before grabbing Ellie's backpack. I lifted her into my arms, and she mumbled something incoherent before settling against my shoulder. I felt the weight of her, warm and trusting, and for the first time that night, my chest ached with something other than anger. She had no idea what was happening. She had no idea that, by the time we landed back home, her entire world would be different. The flight was quiet. Zach put in his earbuds and stared out the window, lost in thought. I kept Ellie close, her soft breath steady against my chest. I tried to rest, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Catherine's face when I walked into that hotel room. Not shocked, not guilty, just annoyed, like I had interrupted something that wasn't meant for me to see. The memory made my stomach turn. I forced my eyes open and stared straight ahead, watching the flight attendants move through the cabin, listening to the hum of the plane, counting down the minutes until we landed. By the time we touched down, it was just after sunrise. The airport was waking up, filling with travelers dragging suitcases and sipping coffee. Ellie yawned, rubbing her eyes as I set her down, and Zach stretched before shoving his hands into his pockets. We moved through the terminal in silence. No one spoke until we were outside, waiting for a cab. "Where's Mom?" Ellie asked sleepily. I took a slow breath, bracing myself. "She's still in Dallas." She frowned. "Why?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "She has things to take care of." It was a weak answer, but she was too tired to question it. She just nodded, leaning against me as Zach watched me closely. I could see it in his eyes. He knew. He didn't know the details, but he knew enough. And soon I'd have to tell him the rest. The cab ride home was quiet. Ellie leaned against my side, half asleep again, while Zach sat stiffly on the other side, staring out the window. I could feel the weight of his silence. He wasn't going to ask anything in front of his sister, but I knew the questions were coming. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as when we left. Nothing had changed except everything had. Ellie stretched as she climbed out of the cab, rubbing her eyes. "Can I have pancakes?" she asked, her voice groggy. I forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart. Go inside and get comfortable. I'll make some." She grinned, running up the steps, her backpack bouncing behind her. Zach lingered, watching me as I paid the driver. "Go ahead," I told him. "I'll be right in." He didn't move. I met his eyes, and there it was, the quiet understanding I had been dreading. "She cheated, didn't she?" His voice was flat, like he had already decided the answer for himself. I swallowed hard. "Zach, you don't have to say it," he muttered. Then he turned and went inside. I stood there for a moment, watching the door swing shut behind him. The truth was out, at least for him, and even though I hadn't confirmed it, I knew he believed it. Inside, Ellie was already at the kitchen table, kicking her feet against the chair, waiting for her pancakes. Zach was nowhere to be seen, probably in his room trying to process things on his own. I took a deep breath and started making breakfast, falling into the rhythm of something normal, something safe. But normal was gone, and no matter how many pancakes I made, nothing was ever going to feel the same again. Ellie ate her pancakes happily, completely unaware that anything was wrong. She chattered about her stuffed animals, about a show she wanted to watch later, about how she couldn't wait to tell her friends that she went on a secret surprise trip. I nodded when I needed to, smiled when it seemed appropriate, but my mind was somewhere else. Zach still hadn't come down. I cleaned up the dishes while Ellie skipped off to the living room, turning on the TV. The sounds of a cartoon filled the space, making it feel deceptively normal. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and took a steadying breath before heading upstairs. His bedroom door was open just enough for me to see inside. He was sitting on his bed, arms resting on his knees, staring at the floor. I knocked lightly. "Hey," I said, "can we talk?" He didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of his bed. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "She was with someone, wasn't she?" he asked quietly. I closed my eyes briefly before nodding. Yeah. His jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything. I didn't want you to find out like this, I said. I didn't want you to have to find out at all. Zach let out a short, bitter laugh. Kind of hard to miss, Dad. I sighed, running a hand over my face. I don't know what's going to happen next, I admitted. But I want you to know that no matter what, I'm here. For you. For Ellie. We're going to be okay. He stared at his hands. What about her? I exhaled. She's going to have to live with the choices she made. He didn't say anything after that, and I knew he needed space. I patted his shoulder and stood up. When I reached the doorway, he spoke again. I don't think I want to talk to her. His voice was quiet but firm. I turned back. You don't have to. Not until you're ready. He nodded and I left him alone. Downstairs, Ellie was still watching TV, laughing at something on the screen. I sat down beside her, pulling her close, inhaling the familiar scent of her shampoo. Are you okay, Daddy? She asked, looking up at me. I kissed the top of her head. Yeah, baby, I will be. I didn't know what the next few days would bring. I didn't know what Catherine would do, if she'd call, if she'd show up at the door. But at that moment, sitting with my daughter, my son upstairs trying to make sense of everything, I knew one thing. We would move forward. Without her.